Hey, what's up everyone? James here, and today, as promised, we are going through IDW's first Transformers Shatterglass series again, remastering my old videos. Even though looking back and watching them, I don't like how they turned out. However, I appreciate them because they helped me find my path on YouTube and show just how much I've grown as a content creator. Now, as we're going through this series, I'm only going to mention things here and there that we'll see in the second series. I will avoid spoiling it for those of you who are new here. Now, with all that out of the way, let's dive into this Shattered Glass universe. For those of you who don't know what is Transformers Shattered Glass, it's an alternate universe where Optimus Prime is a ruthless evil tyrant, and Megatron is a heroic, compassionate leader. A great example of this is if you're familiar with the DC universe, you have Earth Prime, where you have the Justice League. But on Earth 3, another universe, you have their evil counterpart, the Crime Syndicate. In simple terms, our heroes are villains, and our villains are heroes. One of the cool things about this story that makes it unique is that it doesn't take place at the beginning of the Great War like the Autocracy trilogy that we're covering on the channel, or during the Great War like the classic animated series. Instead, this takes place many kilocycles after all of that has already transpired. And though the Decepticons fought hard and the war raged from Cybertron to Earth, in the end, the evil Autobots were victorious. Our story begins with us following the fastest bot alive, the Autobot Blur, who is a part of the Body Scrappers, basically bounty hunters for hire. He is driving through the static zone, passing the volcano-filled Chrome Ridge, towing his latest bounty, the dismembered corpse of the Decepticon Six Shot. Now, the static zone is considered the no man's land of Cybertron. It stands between the territories of the Autobot warlords who reign now on Cybertron. This area of Cybertron originated from the Marvel Transformers comics, but it was called the Rad Zone in there. And it also was in the original Shatterglass comic from Fun Publications. Another thing I want to point out here that Blur passes by in the static zone is a sparkless Metroplex half sunken beneath the ground. Blur's latest bounty takes him to Gold City, home of the Autobot warlord Goldbug. In Blur's inner monologue, we learn the Body Scrappers are the only ones still hunting the Decepticons because the Autobot warlords are too busy fighting each other. Still, all the worthy Decepticons have already been taken out. We also learn where you take bounties in Gold City is to Ratchet. And what's sad about Ratchet is he stays here in Gold City to help these bots that are stuck here. But he also experiments on them using spare parts Blur brings him, trying to create an unbeatable bot because he's traumatized by all the Autobots who fell in battle during the Great War that he couldn't save. Even though he doesn't care to know, Blur explains to Ratchet how he hunted down Six Shot in Proust territory, another warlord. He encountered other bots trying to steal his bounty. Now, these silhouetted bots are the Wreckers. You have Ultra Magnus, Cup, Springer, and Roadbuster, who we will meet in the second Shatterglass series, along with the rest of the members. But we'll never see Roadbuster. He's just here and we never see him again. Ratchet informs Blur of a new bounty from Goldbug that must be brought in alive to get the big payout. This bounty excites Blur because he is an adrenaline junkie. He loves a challenge. Blur asks Ratchet who's the bounty. Ratchet gives him a beacon and answers Megatron's most trusted lieutenant and voice of the Decepticon rebellion, Starscream. Cycles later, that's where we go next. Starscream being hunted down by Body Scrappers Chrome Dome and Hardhead. They're able to injure and corner him, but Starscream pulls out his dual blades and fights back. I love dual blade wielding Starscream. Blur is watching this because he wants to know what Starscream is capable of, especially since he was thought dead. Starscream gains the upper hand when he takes out Hardhead's shoulder cannon, but just when Chrome Dome is about to land a shot on him, that's when Blur interferes and comes to Starscream's aid. After they both take out Chrome Dome and Hardhead, Blur talks Starscream into leaving Gold City in order to explain to him safely why he helped him. At this moment, Blur could have activated the beacon Ratchet gave him, which would have alerted Goldbug, and boom, Starscream would have been easily captured. But he chose not to because he didn't want to share the bounty and risk Starscream escaping. As they pass through the static zone, Starscream stops Blur and holds him at gunpoint. He doesn't believe Blur helped him out of the kindness of his heart. Despite Blur's previous reasons for not capturing Starscream earlier, the biggest reason he doesn't take him down is his ego. He wants his capture of Starscream to be remembered as legendary by walking him right into Goldbug's arms. So he decides to play the long game and pretend to be an Autobot who's had a change of heart. This is where we learn that even though the Autobots won the war and returned to Cybertron, the fighting didn't end. A civil war occurred within Optimus's Autobot faction. Trusted Lieutenants Goldbug and Prowl left with their followers and seized their own territories. Blur tries to convince Starscream he needs him by reminding him he is stuck in the static zone between all three Autobot warlords. Blur says, first you have Goldbug's world, Gold City, where you just left, and every body scrapper there wants to collect your bounty. Second is Prowl's territory. Even if you weren't Cybertron's most wanted bot, everyone is on the menu there. Finally, the Throne of Pax, where Optimus Prime reigns. If Goldbug wants you, Optimus Prime might take you in, if you want to risk it. Now I want you guys to think about this. What if Blur is implying that Prowl's territory is full of cannibalistic Autobots, like the junk zombies of Junkion we met in Monstrosity? That would be insane. Also, as we see here, Optimus's throne is inside the Great Dome of Iacon, meaning at some point Optimus conquered Iacon and renamed it Pax. Starscream seems convinced and puts his blaster down. However, Blur wants to make sure he has him fully convinced by giving him a great sob story. He explains his decision to join the Autobots was not based on passion for the cause, but on survival. He tells him how he was a scout at the beginning of the war, and as the war stretched into thousands of cycles, he was in the heat of battle more and more. After the Autobots won, scouts were out of a job. They made themselves useful as couriers until the packages became darker and darker. In time, packages became contracts, and in order to move freely between territories, the couriers had to accept them. Eventually, they became the body scrappers of today. What's pretty cool here is one of the things we see in Blur's flashbacks is not only Chrome Dome and Hardhead, but also Highbrow and Brainstorm, with Fortress Maximus in the background, showing us all the Autobot headmasters together. Now, Starscream isn't initially sold on Blur's story or his neutrality. This frustrates Blur, but after some back and forth, Starscream eventually accepts his help. As they pass through Chrome Ridge, Blur's plan is to alert Goldbug to their position once they reach the coordinates Starscream gave him. One thing I want to mention in Blur's inner monologue is that Chrome Ridge is what keeps Optimus from conquering Gold City, because it's filled with active volcanoes and is very difficult to maneuver. If he attempted this, he would lose a lot of his forces in the process. Now, Blur believes he has successfully convinced Starscream. He also believes that Starscream's capture will be easy, and he is already planning on adding to his moniker of fastest bot alive, the one who brought Starscream to justice. At that moment, Starscream rams into him. He reveals he never bought into Blur's deception, because no matter what, he's an Autobot at the end of the day. The battle between the Autobot and Decepticon begins. Now remember, Starscream is at a slight disadvantage. One of his wings is still damaged from his fight with Chrome Dome and Hardhead, which means he is unsteady and isn't as fast as he usually is in the air. As the volcanoes around them begin to erupt, they exchange blaster shots, and Blur taunts Starscream, laughing, telling him that he can't keep up and that he'll wear himself out soon. Starscream goes to strike, but Blur quickly dodges it and continues his taunts. He says, "Am I going too fast for you? Let me slow it down for you." He then lights up Starscream with blaster shots to the body. When he charges in to land the final blow, Starscream at the last second flies into the air, avoiding the blow. Blur, not fast enough to stop even himself, lands right into the molten metal. When he realizes he is stuck, he starts panicking. I absolutely love what Starscream says next. He says, "You were right. No Decepticon could outrun you. Blur, the fastest body scrapper, the fastest being on Cybertron. But I didn't need to outrun you. I just needed to outthink you." The molten metal engulfs Blur's body as he screams, "Starscream, I'll kill you." This was a genius play by Starscream. He knew he couldn't maneuver much in Chrome Ridge, especially being injured, but he knew Blur wouldn't be able to maneuver much either. So he kept the fight going until the volcanoes erupted and the molten metal reached them. Now, Starscream stays overnight to make sure Blur can't follow him. As the sun rises and the molten metal has hardened over Blur, created him into a molten rock statue, Starscream says to him, "You did what you promised, Blur, even if it wasn't your intention. You got me one step closer to who I needed to see, one step closer to Megatron." That is who the next video will be focusing on. Hey, what's up everyone? James here, and I'm coming back at you with another Transformers Shattered Glass video, focusing on the mighty and heroic Megatron. Back when I first did this video, I titled it The Tragedy of Megatron. I still like that title, but after analyzing this issue again, The Rise and Fall of Megatron is a way more fitting title, or maybe even like The Rise and Fall of the Decepticons. We'll see what I'll decide to title it. We have a lot to unpack in this story, so buckle in your seatbelts, Beyonders, because I have an incredible, emotional roller coaster in store for you today. With that being said, let's get right into it. So the story opens with Megatron in the Rust Sea, and we've actually been to a similar place in the origin of Orion Pax in the Prime universe called the Rust Spot. Now, what the Rust Sea shares in common with the Rust Spot are they both have corrosive elements in the air, and navigation systems go haywire in the area. We find Megatron choosing to live in a self-imposed exile, having lived in the Rust Seas alone for hundreds, maybe even thousands of cycles. I like that Megatron is walking in the desert clad in a tattered cape, just like the evil Megatron in the Transformers Dark of the Moon film. Starscream arrives and is ecstatic that he was able to find Megatron. However, the feeling really isn't mutual. Megatron isn't happy, and he reminds Starscream that he told him to stay away. Starscream ends up passing out from the wounds he got in his battle with Blur. Initially, Megatron didn't want to help Starscream, but his compassion for his former loyal lieutenant forces him to. He takes Starscream to his hidden bunker. Now, Megatron answers the question of how did Starscream get coordinates to his location? And though he doesn't want to think about it, in his inner monologue, he reveals that he sent it to all the Seekers at some point in the past, just in case they needed him. Once Starscream awakens, he tells Megatron about his recent fight with Blur and how he now has a big bounty on his head. He isn't sure of how the Autobots got wind of his activities, but deduces that they must have overheard or been tracking him ever since he left. He does bring up the possibility of Jetfire having something to do with it, but quickly changes the subject of conversation, not wanting to discuss Jetfire further. And there's a lot more to that story, and we'll learn about that in the next issue, which focuses on Starscream. In the meantime, Starscream comes across an old, worn-out poster of Megatron. It reminds him of the first time he saw him. And at first, Megatron believes he's talking about the first time they met, when Starscream approached him to join the Decepticons. And what's interesting about that is Megatron mentions he actually rejected Starscream many times before he allowed him to join the Decepticons. And the reason why is that he didn't want to put a scholar on the battlefield. Starscream reveals that that wasn't the first time he saw Megatron. It was actually during the early labor protests in front of the Senate. He was there with Jetfire to argue for public funding for their work. Megatron was there protesting for miners' rights and for the banning of the return of Imperator. Now, Imperator, for those of you who don't know, is an old tradition used in the old days of Cybertron, where bots who were branded criminals had their hands and heads removed and were installed with new fingerless and faceless replacements, so everyone in Cybertronian society knows to shun them. It's a pretty messed up tradition. During the protest, Megatron had gotten into a confrontation with Prowl, who was basically a police officer. He had put his hands on his friend Ratbat. Now, Ratbat being a friend of Megatron and helping to fight for miners' rights is in stark contrast to the Ratbat we met in Megatron's origin in the Prime universe, where he was a corrupt, opportunistic senator behind the automation of the Energon mines, taking the miners' jobs away, amongst other things. Check out the full story video on the channel if you haven't seen it. Prowl's excuse for putting his hands on Ratbat was that he was too close to the Senate building. However, Megatron calls out Prowl for just wanting a reason to attack those he views as beneath him, and points out that he wouldn't have put his hands on Ratbat if he was part of the counter protest that's there. That bots like him have gotten comfortable with the hierarchy, where laborers are seen as less than and only worth nothing but cruelty. When Prowl says you may get away with actions like this because of your friendship with the senators and Orion protects you, but you're still mining trash. This angers Megatron. He lifts Prowl off the ground, grips his head while saying, "Repeat the word trash and you'll see what this trash can do." That incident is what inspired Starscream, seeing a miner considered to be of low standing stand up to the Autobots, showing them that he is an equal. Starscream even recalls that that drama played a large part in Ratbat eventually being elected to the Senate. Now Megatron doesn't adore his memory of that day as Starscream does. What Starscream remembers as a great moment, Megatron recalls as the day he got arrested and became an example of what happens when you step out of line. And he mentions Ratbat being elected to the Senate ended up not doing much for their cause. For those of you who saw my Shattered Glass 2 videos, we know it doesn't end well for Senator Ratbat. Megatron asks Starscream why he came to him, and Starscream reveals that he came for his help in forming the Decepticons again, but Megatron refuses. From here we see a flashback of Megatron being released from prison. The bot behind his release was his friend, Orion Pax. I've always loved the way evil Optimus looks. They get into a confrontation here because Orion is angry that Megatron isn't thankful for his prison release and for all the times Orion has had to wipe away disorderly conduct charges from his record. Still, Megatron believes he doesn't owe him anything, but Orion begs to differ. He explains that he's vouched for him multiple times because his protests calling for rights and empathy are nothing but chaos. However, Megatron argues he is protesting for more than rights and empathy. He's fighting against traditions like Imperator returning, which he accuses Orion and his secret police having had done to Senator Shockwave. Orion brushes off Megatron's accusation as just a crazy conspiracy theory. Still, he does threaten Megatron by mentioning that if he really does have that kind of power, then he should watch what he says or else he might lose his voice box. After he says that, Megatron becomes enraged and strikes Orion right in the chest, smashing his right windshield. And Orion strikes back, but before the fight gets even crazier, it gets interrupted by Chrome Dome and Prowl. Orion decides not to press charges, but he does say to Megatron how they could have been on the same side, standing together. But Megatron replies, "That's where you are wrong, Orion. I could have never been on your side." That day, their friendship died, and the fight for the fate of Cybertron began. Back in the present day, as Megatron and Starscream walk onto the Rust Sea, Megatron wonders if all those times he allowed Orion to pull the strings to get him out of trouble in some way makes him complicit in the evil Orion committed. Then maybe his self-imposed exile is him making up for all those times he should have faced punishment. Starscream astutely deduces this. He mentions to Megatron that it seems like he came to the Rust Sea to slowly rust away. At that moment, Megatron tells Starscream that he is no longer the leader of the Decepticons. And when Starscream refuses to believe that and refuses to leave without him, Megatron yells that he is no longer his commander, that it's a title he was never worthy of because his decisions cost them the war and the lives of their fellow Decepticons. He reminds Starscream of their final battle on Earth, and this is my favorite part of the issue. We go to the streets of Los Angeles, witnessing the Decepticons' final push against the Autobots. Megatron gives an amazing speech coming from the deepest corners of his spark. In his speech, we get the history of their time on Earth. He says, "Some of you came with me on Earth when I crashed, helped me heal my wounds. Some of you came later after we discovered rarefied energon and knew we had to protect this planet from Optimus Prime and his Autobots. We've made mistakes, and perhaps the Earth will never return to what it once was. But it is not the end for humans or us. We fight today so that we all might see what the future holds." From there, the battle raged, and eventually, Megatron confronted his former friend turned nemesis, Optimus Prime. The fight is incredible. Megatron says, "I fought like a fool on the battlefield. A fool who threw himself at a monster." Megatron fired his fusion cannon first, and Optimus answered with a sidekick that Megatron blocked. Optimus quickly gained the upper hand when he unleashed a wave of blaster shots at Megatron's frame and slammed him with a fist to the face. In his inner monologue, Megatron says, "The earth crumbled beneath my frame and it collapsed under the weight of our war." At that moment, I decided to be a martyr. He pulled his tank sword and fought with everything he had for the Decepticon cause, for Earth and Cybertron. Though he fought hard and gained the upper hand at one point, it simply wasn't enough. The evil monster that is Optimus Prime won, standing victorious over Megatron's unconscious body. Megatron says, "I laid there for what might have been cycles, decacycles or kilocycles, until I could hear nothing. With no repairs and leaking energon, I waited for my spark to go out." The mighty Megatron, leader of the Decepticons, had died under the boot of the greatest tyrant, who I once called a friend. When my spark proved too stubborn to go out, I found a ship, patched myself up, and repaired it. Once I reached Cybertron, I thought I should have just stayed on Earth because I discovered that most of the Decepticons were scattered or dead. Optimus Prime, Goldbug, and Prowl had resorted to infighting, becoming the Autobot Warlords 3. I love Starscream's reply here because he gives it to Megatron straight. He tells him his belief that he's not worthy enough to lead them and that he is the reason why they failed is nothing but nonsense because he remembers that day very differently. He saw the Decepticons dive into battle, being led by a leader who inspired them and was fearless and dashing. What's funny is Megatron tries to interrupt and Starscream continues, "Don't worry, he had equally dashing soldiers at his back." Starscream says, "But even that wasn't what we spoke about after the battle. We spoke about how you saved Thundercracker from Bumblebee when you annihilated him with a point-blank blaster shot to the face that led to him needing a new body. More on that story later. We drank to the vision of you taking down wave after wave of Autobots on your own. Tyrants fell at your feet. Perhaps you saw yourself as a martyr, but you were a hero to us." Once Optimus arrived on the battlefield and the Decepticons began to be overwhelmed, Megatron had ordered them to leave while he stayed behind to battle Optimus and buy them as much time as he could. And initially the Seekers refused, but Megatron convinced them. He says, "Enough. If you stay with me, we all die. If I go with you, Optimus won't stop until he hunts us all down. You must round up as many Decepticons as possible and get them off the planet. Starscream, Thundercracker, and Skywarp, I need you to do this not for me, but for our cause." Starscream says, "There was nothing for me to say. I followed your orders. We escaped, but I didn't see you fall or know how long you spent on Earth. However, I do know that our loss wasn't on your shoulders, nor were the lives lost. Those that survived lived on because of your sacrifice. You were willing to lose to keep us alive." This is an absolutely epic moment from Starscream because he makes Megatron realize how wrong he was by explaining it through his and his fellow Decepticons' perspective. That's why he needs him. They're scattered and will only rally behind the bot who saved their lives. Megatron wonders if he were to lead again, what cause could they rally behind now? Starscream reminds him that he's been underground a very long time and things are different, and now he may have just changed things. Back in the bunker, he jogs Megatron's memory of a conversation about how they could theoretically use his indestructible spark as a safe. Starscream says, "What if I told you it's no longer theoretical? What if I told you we use what I have inside me to wake the Titans?" Starscream reveals an image of Metroplex and says, "We can take back Cybertron." That's the end of the video. Megatron and the Decepticons will rise from the ashes. I hope you all enjoyed the video. We are back continuing to remaster my old Transformers Shattered Glass videos on the first series. If you haven't seen the last two I did focusing on Blur and Megatron, the link to the playlist will be as always in the description box and in a pinned comment down below. This issue will focus on Starscream and it's so awesome. So remember, we last left off with Starscream revealing to Megatron that within his spark is the key to reviving Metroplex and adding a Titan to their forces. We go to him and Megatron in the heart of Gold City, where Goldbug reigns. The next video in the series will center around Goldbug, and I can't wait for it. They meet up with Soundwave's mini cassettes, Ravage, and Laserbeak, who leads them to my boy, Soundwave. Or for all of you who have been around the channel for a while, you know I like to call him Heroic Soundwave. Soundwave welcomes them to Decepticon Radio, his underground pirate radio where he stays in communications with surviving Decepticons. Despite the war being long over, he still does his job. During the Great War, Soundwave was the Decepticons' top morale officer, doing his best to prevent trauma. Through Decepticon Radio, he serves as a lifeline to the scattered remaining Decepticons, reminding them that they are not alone, and he helps them through their trauma. This is one of the things I love about his character. He's been doing this non-stop since the war ended, hiding the exhaustion he feels, putting on a performance. This is why I call him Heroic Soundwave, because he has put his fellow Decepticons before himself, and he has never given up. Megatron and Starscream ask him to reach out to all the remaining Decepticons with a will to fight to join them. Soundwave informs Starscream that he's already reached out to some Decepticons, Starscream's fellow Seekers. Starscream is thankful, but he can see through Soundwave's performance and tries to tell him that he needs to rest, but Soundwave refuses because he doesn't want to risk any of his fellow Decepticons hitting rock bottom and not being there for them. He reveals to Starscream that word has spread of his big light show at Metroplex. Now it's because of that why Starscream now has a bounty on his head. What that is going to be explained in a bit, because from here we go to a flashback. We go back to before the war, back to Megatron's protest in front of the Senate, which we saw in the last video, but this time we see it from Starscream and Jetfire's point of view. Whereas Starscream is inspired by the sight of a miner standing against a corrupt government seeking equal rights for his fellow miners, Jetfire comes across as more annoyed by it, but in reality he's annoyed by the number of rejections they've received for funding for their research. He doesn't care about the miners' protests. Their research is focusing on waking Metroplex in order to learn more about Cybertron and understand its history. One of the bots they meet with for funding is Senator Orion Pax. Before they even finish explaining their research, he cuts them off by throwing Jetfire's datapad. Orion tells them he already knows about their research and that academic funding isn't the type of funding they should be seeking. He offers to fund their research, but only as long as they can get results, and if their research remains private. It was at that moment the rumors Starscream heard of a shadow that was slowly encroaching on the government that planned to take away more of the people's freedoms he finally believed. He rejects Orion's proposal and walks away. Now, at some point, they were able to get academic funding, but we never find out from who. It's because of this funding they were able to finally unearth Metroplex's head. However, the problem they're facing now is they haven't been able to create a code that successfully translates Metroplex's thoughts to speech, and have been working on it for a while. Jetfire is worried their funding will soon run out and brings up Orion's proposal as an option. But when it comes to Starscream, that isn't an option. He says, "I'm not giving Cybertron's history to a tyrant like Orion, who seeks to control everything." He asks Jetfire to promise never to bring up Orion again. Reluctantly, Jetfire agrees. Now, before we find out more about Starscream's past, we head back to present day. Megatron and Starscream are in a remote watering hole, waiting on the Decepticon forces Soundwave has reached out to. Starscream tells Megatron after they've gathered their forces and waked Metroplex, they need to recruit a new generation of Decepticons for this new war. That there are Cybertronians out there who are tired of the Autobots' tyrannical autocracy. They can use this opportunity to turn those Cybertronians to their side, and maybe even some Autobots. Starscream then takes notice of the bots in this bar watching Megatron and him. Megatron says the war has already begun. He flips the table, revealing the hidden Autobot spy, Eject. At that moment, Blaster and his mini cassettes burst into the bar. Driven by their desire for a double bounty, Blaster and his mini cassettes attack. Megatron and Starscream hold their own against them. Starscream knocks back Eject, and he and Megatron double team Playback. Starscream slices Playback in half, and Megatron blows apart Eject. Blaster hits Starscream with a sonic blast, but before he can land a fatal blow, Megatron grabs him from behind and orders Starscream to run. Even though every part of him wanted to stay and fight with Megatron, he obeys Megatron's order. However, once he successfully escapes, he regrets obeying it, because he feels like he can't do this alone. From there, we return to the past, to the day Jetfire betrayed Starscream. One day, Starscream followed him and saw that Jetfire was secretly meeting with Orion and his cabal of Autobots. Behind his back, Jetfire had accepted Orion's offer for funding their research. During his meeting with Orion, Starscream hears Jetfire reveal their plan to utilize his spark as a conduit to wake Metroplex. He ends up being discovered and hauled in before Orion. They accuse him of being a Decepticon, or at the very least a Decepticon sympathizer, but Jetfire aggressively insists that he is loyal and is neither. He yells at Starscream to tell Orion and his Autobots that he isn't a Decepticon. Starscream says, "I'm no Decepticon. The Decepticons are fighting against the Autobots, who are taking our work and destroying what they can't control, and you're okay with that. I trusted in who we are and should be. I may not be a Decepticon, but I am definitely not an Autobot. And you, Jetfire, turned your back on us all." Jetfire responds by punching Starscream right in the face. He walks away, leaving Starscream's fate in the hands of Orion and his Autobots. Luckily, Starscream acts quickly and is able to escape their grasp. It wasn't until I covered this video again that I realized how much impact Jetfire's betrayal had on Starscream. Starscream journeys to Metroplex and starts destroying all of his and Jetfire's work on him, so it doesn't fall into Orion's hands. However, he stopped himself because he couldn't destroy it all, because he still believed Metroplex had to be the solution to their problems. He tried to download and bind all of the data on Metroplex to his spark, but his download was interrupted when Jetfire alongside the Autobots arrived. He was able to escape before they found him, but Metroplex's code in his spark ended up being corrupted. Now, after the defeat of the Decepticons on Earth, Starscream went into isolation, and in his isolation he re-examined the corrupted code inside him. It took him a mega cycle, but he was finally able to figure it out. Once he did, he returned to Metroplex. He heard the Autobots attempted to use other bots' sparks to communicate with Metroplex, but none of their sparks were strong enough. With the code within him finally deciphered, Starscream was able to bridge the gap between himself and what was left at Metroplex. Once he connected himself to Metroplex, he bound his spark to the Titan, to Cybertron's past and all of its secrets. Starscream says in his inner monologue, "Every part of me screamed in agony. Every part of me sang with the words of a Titan. Everything I believed in, everything they wanted to take from us was now in me." Back in the present day, unfortunately for Starscream, he wasn't able to flee far after Megatron ordered him to. He was shot from behind and knocked unconscious. When his system started to come back online, he hoped it was his fellow Seekers, but he knew it wasn't. He awoke to Goldbug standing over him and his former best friend, now worst enemy, Jetfire. That's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Bumblebee is dead. Now witness the rise of Goldbug. What's up everyone, James here, and we are back with Transformers Shattered Glass. This is my favorite issue in the series, so I'm excited. So quick reminder, at the end of the last video, Starscream was captured by Goldbug and Jetfire. But before we pick up where we left off, we're going to go over the origin of how Bumblebee became Goldbug. It begins with Goldbug narrating his origin. He says that he should have been a legendary Autobot after the war on Earth. He earned his place as Optimus Prime's second in command, but his dream of legendary status and his position came crashing down after Megatron defeated him in that final battle on Earth, because the Autobots don't reward failure. We saw in Megatron's video that he obliterated Bumblebee, saving Thundercracker in the process. After the battle on Earth, Bumblebee was revived with a new, stronger, and bolder frame, and a name of his choosing that wouldn't be said with a patronizing smirk: Goldbug. This was only possible due to Optimus and Prowl ordering Ratchet to bring protoforms to Earth in case something happened. What Goldbug learned after his revival is Optimus only agreed to revive him because they had the materials. In reality, based on what we know about Ratchet in this universe, we can surmise he's the one who really fought for Bumblebee to be revived. Despite agreeing to revive Bumblebee, Optimus still viewed it as a waste of resources, because all the Autobots had whispered to each other Bumblebee failed to kill a Seeker and didn't even leave a mark on Megatron. So from their point of view, he didn't deserve to be revived. So whatever respect Bumblebee had amongst the Autobots definitely was lost when he became Goldbug. Sometime later, the Autobots had returned to Cybertron, and at some point Goldbug had learned about Prowl planning to stage a coup. He tried to warn Optimus Prime about this, but Optimus didn't care to hear his warnings and didn't believe him. He does mention the war broke something in Prowl, but unfortunately what that is we never find out. Optimus, not heeding Goldbug's warnings, frustrates him to the point that he insults Prime by telling him that he basically has his own head up his butt. At that moment, Prime stares him down, and Goldbug tries to take it back, but Optimus crushes him with his response. He says, "I have conquered greater creatures than you or Prowl could ever imagine. I crushed Megatron and the Decepticons under my foot. Prowl can plot all he wants, and you can whine about it. Either way, I need not concern myself with the plans of lesser Cybertronians. Ultimately, I can destroy you with a word and leave you to the gutters." He hits Goldbug with this drill and says, "Because I'm the one with power, Bumblebee." Now, after Optimus Prime leaves, coming out of the shadows is Prowl, reminding Goldbug that he told him Optimus wouldn't listen to him. That Optimus is right about one thing: it's all about power on Cybertron. Whether you use your form or brain, that's all that matters. He says, "Now are you finally going to listen to me on how we're going to take Cybertron?" Now what happened next, you could say Goldbug joined Prowl in his scheme, or he just decided to go out on his own. Either way, the day came when Goldbug battled Optimus Prime. And even though he tried his best, Goldbug failed to defeat him and ran away from the fight. However, ever since that day, Goldbug has been determined to eventually defeat Optimus in battle or by achieving what he never could, and determined to never be a joke ever again. He became one of the 3 Autobot warlords and built Gold City. From here we arrive at the present day, with Starscream being tortured by Goldbug and Jetfire. Starscream is refusing to give up what Jetfire is calling the Titan communication key that's tied to his spark. Now, a major flaw of Goldbug is he's in such a rush to outdo and defeat Optimus in order to prove that he is the greatest of the Autobots, that he isn't willing to wait to get the key from Starscream. He wants to kill him, take the key, and dump the body. But Jetfire informs him that is impossible, because damaging Starscream's spark may damage the Titan key. At that moment, they get an alert that an intruder has entered the facility, and Goldbug leaves to handle it himself. That intruder is revealed to be Skywarp, coming to save his fellow Seeker. However, that's not happening. Goldbug finds him and strikes. He beats Skywarp like he stole something, just beats him within an inch of his life, and adds insult to injury by taking his head. This displays just how ruthless Goldbug is, and it isn't over. As Jetfire continues to torture Starscream, he mentions to Slicer that he believes Starscream is really resisting because of his personal grudge towards him. And before anyone says Slicer isn't his name, yes it is. He doesn't go by Wheeljack in the Shatterglass universe. Goldbug shows back up and tosses Skywarp's head towards Starscream, who is horrified at the sight. Goldbug orders Slicer to take a squad and kill any Decepticon sympathizers within Gold City, and to Jetfire to obtain the Titan key. Still, Jetfire insists that he needs more time. Goldbug, though, doesn't care anymore. If Starscream isn't giving him a Titan, then he'll use his body to lure in and kill all the Decepticons. Out of nowhere, Starscream begins laughing and tells Goldbug he hasn't changed, that he learned nothing from all the years kneeling at Optimus's feet. Goldbug becomes furious and tries to kill Starscream, but Jetfire stops him, reminding him he'll lose the Titan forever. Luckily, Slicer interrupts the chaos and informs Goldbug that they've got more company. We then go to Tap Out and Freeway standing guard. They don't matter because a Cerebro shell drops on top of them and infects Freeway. He takes out Tap Out and then goes nuts. Who did this? Well, the Insecticons. Now the original Insecticon group is here, the leader Shrapnel, who goes by Scrapnel in the Shatterglass universe, Bombshell, and Kickback. Also here are the lesser known Insecticons, Ransack, Chop Chop, Barrage, and Venom. They start running through the facility, taking out guards as they make their way to rescue Starscream. Their success though is short-lived. Goldbug ambushes them, killing Bombshell. He then takes on all the Insecticons by himself, taking them out one by one until none are left standing. After he's done, he radios Jetfire asking for an update on the key, who responds asking if he's lost his mind because he hasn't been gone long. The status hasn't changed. At that moment, Goldbug reaches his boiling point. He has had enough. He says in his inner monologue, "I've dealt with the Seeker and the Insecticons. There is only one Autobot here who hasn't done what he's supposed to. Only one, too weak, begging for me to let him be solved. I guess Goldbug is going to have to finish his work too." Goldbug returns to the interrogation room with his blaster aimed at Starscream, ready to end him. That's the end of the video. We are at the end of Transformers Shattered Glass. The last video we're remastering is Jetfire's Redemption. If you haven't seen any of the Shattered Glass videos, the link to the playlist will be in a pinned comment below. It begins with a flashback of Jetfire being defeated by Starscream at some point during the War on Earth. Jetfire in his inner monologue talks about how he's been haunted by that defeat. In that war, he learned about his weakness and how to be stronger. He chose the side of strength and order because the Decepticons have never been strong enough to hold power. All the warlords have always crushed their rebellions. One thing I want to point out here is we see that Megatron and the Decepticons have launched a full-scale assault on Gold City. Jetfire continues, saying if Megatron and the Decepticons were meant to be in charge, they actually win for once instead of always dying. I lived by these beliefs for nano-cycles. So why now am I throwing myself between Starscream and Goldbug? This takes us right back to where we left off in that last video. Goldbug plans on killing Starscream. Even though Jetfire reminds him they don't know if the Titan King will work if he's dead. However, Goldbug isn't listening to him anymore, because at this point he views it as Jetfire not wanting to kill a former friend. Jetfire says in his inner monologue, "All I've ever wanted to be was a scientist, but that dream is gone. I've been an informer, a traitor, and now Goldbug demands me to be an executioner." What Starscream says next reveals, at least in my opinion, that he stopped holding anger toward Jetfire a long time ago, and there's going to be even more evidence of that in a bit. He says, "Tell Goldbug the truth. You betrayed my trust because you thought you could protect me from their war." Goldbug begins beating down Starscream and tells him either Jetfire will kill him or he'll kill them both. Suddenly the facility shakes and the ground beneath them rumbles. I like how Starscream, even though he's getting beat up by Goldbug, he doesn't pass up that chance to get under his skin even more. He points out that Megatron's attack on Gold City probably has him scared. Just when Goldbug is about to strike him again, Jetfire reacts. He punches Goldbug straight in the optics, sending him flying back. In his inner monologue, he says, "I react not because Goldbug threatened my life, not because he is going to kill Starscream, or not because of Megatron's attack on the city, but because Starscream's words were enough to shake me. I'd forgotten that his words always had that power over me." Jetfire helps Starscream to his feet, and we see this great heartfelt moment between friends. But unfortunately, it lasts but a nano-cycle, because at that moment, Starscream gets blasted from behind by Goldbug, who then walks up behind him, plunging his fist through his chest and gripping his spark. A scream unlike any other is heard all across Gold City. Goldbug has killed Starscream. Jetfire is in such a state of shock that he doesn't know how to react. All he can think about is how he believes he did this to Starscream. He then remembers during the war, time after time, Starscream showed he forgave him and wanted them to be at each other's side, to believe in his dream of Cybertron, but he was always too scared to take his hand. Even in his last moments, he forgave him, but now it's too late. As a squadron of Goldbug's Autobots enters the room, Goldbug reminds Jetfire that he told him Starscream was never walking out of this room, and if he doesn't, that's his own fault. After Goldbug leaves the room, the squad surrounds Jetfire, and he finally snaps out of his state of shock and loses it. He grabs one of these bots and rips his arms off, and then demolishes the rest of the squad. At that moment, Soundwave and a squad of Autobots blow into the facility. What happens next is Jetfire then has this moment where he passes the blame from himself to then the Autobots and Decepticons war, saying to himself their war caused Starscream's death. Whether it's Goldbug, Optimus Prime, or Megatron's cause, they're to blame. He attempts to fly away with Starscream's body, but Megatron sees this and knocks him out of the sky. He tells Jetfire he's hurt him enough. Once they're both on the ground, Jetfire blames Megatron for turning Starscream from the scholar and explorer he was into a soldier, and blames him for his death now. Megatron doesn't attack Jetfire, he just restrains him, telling him to stop, that this isn't what Starscream would have wanted. I know it seems like Jetfire's all over the place blaming everything for Starscream's death, but it's because he's grieving. Eventually though, he calms down and ultimately accepts Starscream's death. Megatron says he's taken the city. After they clean it up, he'll erect a memorial to Starscream, and ask Jetfire to join him. Not to fight for the cause, but to help each other get Starscream's spark from Goldbug. Jetfire responds that he'll consider it, and before flying off tells Megatron, when they erect that memorial of Starscream, to make it something dramatic. Sometime later, we see this hooded figure within Gold City heading into a manhole. This hooded figure is revealed to be Slicer, who's reporting to his real boss, Ultra Magnus. He's been a double agent this entire time. He informs Magnus his cover wasn't blown, but Goldbug City has fallen to Megatron, and that Goldbug now holds the Titan key, Starscream's spark. Ultra Magnus says Goldbug's fall was easily foreseen. Gold City no longer interests the other warlords, and Goldbug will figure out what to do with the spark given enough time. You were not the only spy in his ranks. Word has traveled across Cybertron. If Goldbug doesn't work quickly, Prowl is waiting in the wilds, ready to snatch it from him. And Prime has had plans for that spark for a nano-cycle. For the Autobot that controls the spark, controls the Titans. And the bot that controls the Titans, controls Cybertron. At that moment, in the static zone, Goldbug seems to have successfully awakened Metroplex. The war for Cybertron and the war for Metroplex has officially begun. The cliffhanger we thought we would forever be left on. The sequel we thought we would never get. It's here. It is finally here. Transformers Shattered Glass is back. This is IDW's final Transformers series. Okay, so before we get started, for those of you new here, I have a playlist of the previous series in the description box below, or you should see a card pop up right here. Eventually, at some point, I want to remaster those videos because I feel like I can improve on them. Let me know in the comments below if you guys would like that. With that being said, let's get right into it. So this first issue is so freaking good. Oh my god. One of my critiques of this issue though is that it doesn't do flashbacks as well as Last Spot Standing. To be specific, there's like no separation in the artwork to help you identify what's a flashback and what's present day, and it is a little jarring. So I'm going to do all the flashbacks in order and then go into the present day. So the issue opens sometime before the Great War. We see Senator Shockwave coming to speak to his friend Ultra Magnus. Now remember, back in issue 2 of Shattered Glass, Megatron accused Orion of using his secret police to remove Shockwave from power and went as far as performing Imperator on him. And for those of you who don't know what Imperator is, it's a form of punishment done to criminals that removes their heads and hands and install new faceless and fingerless replacements, so everyone knows to shun them. In this issue, we're going to learn how that happened and who's Orion's secret police. Now, in this Shattered Glass reality, Ultra Magnus is more bureaucrat than a soldier. Shockwave is confronting Magnus about his relationship with Orion Pax, who he has been legally advising. Shockwave mentions that his advice has been helping Orion abuse and manipulate the system, and he fears that he's being used. Ultra Magnus points out that they are using his expertise, that it's meant to be used, and he feels insulted that Shockwave believes he would encourage breaking their laws. Suddenly, Bumblebee enters the room, interrupting their conversation, bringing a message from Orion, and that pretty much ends this discussion between Shockwave and Magnus. But I want to point this out, I want to mention this. So I want you to think of Magnus as the brains behind Orion's power play to slowly take over Cybertron, because that's going to become more and more clear as this story progresses. Some time passes, and with the help of Magnus, Orion's power and influence have grown on Cybertron. We go to a meeting between the two where Orion is promoting Magnus as leader of his secret squad. And this squad was actually created by Ultra Magnus himself at some point in time. It's safe to assume that as the time has passed, they've already carried out some dirty work for Orion. Though it is a promotion, Magnus is hesitant to accept it because he's a bureaucrat, not a soldier, and suggests Prowl be given this role. However, Orion argues that he is the only bot qualified, since he knows the limits of what this squad can do in public, and he wants Prowl right where he can see him. When Magnus chimes in that the law isn't a game of limits, this is where Orion breaks Magnus's facade of an innocent bot that he's been putting on. Orion tells him that he's too smart to pretend that he didn't know what he was doing, to admit to himself that he was fascinated by puzzling out how to break the laws and the power that came with it. He grabs Magnus's head, brushing through his hologram, saying, "You're going to break that hologram you love to wear so much from stress." Now, if you're wondering what's behind this hologram, you'll learn that in a bit. It's safe to assume you guys already know. But anyways, in the meantime, we see the members of Magnus's squad: Impactor, Slicer, Cup, Bumblebee, and Springer. I really like Cup's design here and how badass he looks with the cigar. He always has to have a cigar. After a short time, we see Senator Shockwave being asked by the press, Laserbeak, and Flashback about a division in the military going on, until they get scared away by Magnus's squad. Shockwave disapproves of this, and he confronts Magnus about it, and his squad is quick to anger. Magnus tries to calm them down by saying Shockwave is a friend, but Shockwave tells him he thought he was a friend until he became leader of Orion's band of rabid Death Eagles. Impactor gets pissed and goes after Shockwave. Magnus orders him to stop, but he doesn't listen. He even grabs the arm of Shockwave until Shockwave wrings himself free. As Magnus tries to continue to stop this confrontation before it escalates further, Cup starts mocking him, telling Magnus that he can't think of a law to get himself out of this situation and should do something already. The huge amount of pressure Magnus feels begins to break his hologram, revealing his true face. He grabs Cup and throws him at Impactor, taking him out completely. After the situation de-escalates, Shockwave asks Magnus if he was incapable of stopping Impactor, or was he just too cowardly to admit he never wanted to stop him. Slicer then asks Magnus about what to do with Impactor. Magnus answers to leave him, and that he'll be making some changes. Dude, I absolutely love Magnus's skull-faced look. It is badass. He just looks menacing and terrifying. Later, we go to a confrontation between Orion and Magnus. Orion is pissed at Magnus for dismissing Impactor from his squad. So this shows that Orion's so-called promotion was just BS. He wanted Ultra Magnus to just be the face of his death squad. Ultra Magnus tells Orion that he's not the official leader of the squad. According to all the paperwork, he is the leader, the one they must follow, and it's within his right to dismiss anyone who is insubordinate and unwilling to compromise. He assures Orion that he and his newly christened Wreckers remain loyal to his cause, and that if he has any doubts, let them prove it. Surprised by Magnus's unflinching attitude, Orion begrudgingly agrees with him and gives him a mission to prove his loyalty, which is an all-out assault on the Senate. And that's where we go to next. Ultra Magnus with his wreckers and new member Jazz taking out the entire Senate. Magnus rips apart Senator Ratbat as he calls out for Shockwave to show himself. When Shockwave appears, Ultra Magnus lays the beat down on him. Magnus tells Shockwave to stop struggling, that he's not a fighter. Shockwave is shocked at the fact that Ultra Magnus is capable of doing this, and he tries to remind Magnus of the honorable bot he used to be and can still be again. But Magnus just toys with Shockwave, showing the hologram of the Magnus he knows. He ends Shockwave's pleas with a fist to the face. We then see Ultra Magnus carrying a mangled, heavily damaged Shockwave on his shoulder while saying, once they perform in Prorata, you won't be upset by this anymore. Honestly, I think I'm jealous. Now that's the end of the flashbacks. We then go to present day, sometime after Goldbug lost Gold City to Megatron and his Decepticons, but was able to use the information encoded in Starscream's Spark to wake Metroplex. We see Ultra Magnus with his wreckers, who have gone through a roster change, arriving at the throne of Pax. I love this wreckers roster. He has even more heavy hitters: Rodimus, Drift, Sandstorm, and Ricochet. Orion's guards, Whirl, and Sunstreaker aren't allowing them to go through. I love Magnus's threat to them. He says, if you don't allow us to pass, the only kindness you will ever know is picking which wreckers will grind you down to powder. When they try to cite the law to Magnus, he becomes furious and grabs Whirl and tells them that he wrote the laws and they did away with them a long time ago anyways. Now, one thing I want to point out that might be confusing is they call Orion Optimus now, but we haven't seen any evidence that he received the Matrix of Leadership, so I don't know why they're referring to him as Optimus, but I'll just call him that from now on. Optimus calls Sunstreaker and tells him to allow Magnus through, but he can only bring one of the wreckers with him. And I like that the wreckers are so fiercely loyal to him, not wanting to let him go in alone, but he assures them that it will be okay. Once Jazz and Ultra Magnus enter Optimus's throne room, Magnus informs Optimus about the Decepticons taking over Gold City and building an army. He understands the significance of Metroplex awakening, but warns him that he and Prowl shouldn't ignore the Decepticons. Optimus gets annoyed here, asking Magnus if he is suggesting he should be afraid. And what Optimus says next shows just how arrogant he has become. And honestly, rightfully so. This guy defeated the Decepticons on Cybertron, finished them off on Earth, fought Goldbug one-on-one, and sent him running. None of the warlords have dared to invade his territory in all this time, so it's understandable why he is the way he is. He tells Magnus that the Decepticons are pests and nothing more, and mentions that they were only able to take Gold City because Goldbug hasn't been good for anything except picking bots out of his wheels. He ends up laughing off Magnus's warning, and this gets Jazz really frustrated, to the point that he yells at Optimus, pointing out that every time one of the warlords haven't listened to Magnus, they've lost the battle, and reminds Optimus he wouldn't have gotten this city or won the war if it wasn't for Magnus and the wreckers. Suddenly Optimus comes up and just backhands Jazz, yelling enough, and he tells Magnus that he thought he had better control of his men. Okay, stop what you're doing and pay attention because it's about to get real. It's about to go down. After leaving the throne room, Magnus informs Jazz that Optimus's plan is just to have the wreckers and his men fight everyone, basically. Prowl, Goldbug, and his Titan, and the Decepticons. When Jazz scoffs off at the idea, Magnus says, "You may be right. What good is one of Optimus's plans without me to work it? Fortunately, I was prepared for exactly this. Jazz, give the word." Magnus then rips the head off one of the guards. Jazz takes out the other guard and says, "Wreck and ruin." As Ultra Magnus enters back into Optimus's fortress, the wreckers are taking out, or should I say, wrecking, all of Orion's forces. Oh my god, this is awesome. When Magnus enters the throne room, he says, "On second thought, perhaps I didn't explain myself clearly, Orion." Optimus starts to beat down Magnus while saying, "You're supposed to be the brain, but your arrogance has fried your circuitry. I shouldn't have to remind you of your place. I allowed you your wreckers. I granted your position." As Optimus is about to land another blow, Magnus stops him by grabbing his fist and breaking his arm. Furious and enraged, he says, "I am the source of your authority, fool. I created your army and I gave you the Senate." Magnus turns into his alt form as Optimus tries to run away. Magnus then rams him from behind right through his throne as Optimus yells no. When Optimus tries to get to his feet, Magnus stomps and crushes his chest while asking, "How does it feel to have been right about me this whole time? If Shockwave saw this, he'd feel your pain." In his inner monologue, Magnus says, "None of you will be privileged to the inner workings of my mind, but rest assured, you will see me execute my plans." That is the end of Shattered Glass 2 Issue 1. I told you guys it was going to happen, and it did. Blaster versus my boy Heroic Soundwave is here. Hey, what's up everyone? We are back with Transformers Shattered Glass. One of the things I love about this series is how each issue focuses on a particular character while simultaneously pushing the story forward. The last issue focused on Ultra Magnus, and this second issue focuses on Blaster. Now, remember the last time we saw Blaster was in Shattered Glass issue 3 when he tried to take out Megatron and Starscream with his team of Autobot cassettes? Of course, he lost and it cost him playback and eject. A mistake I want to point out is you'll see Rewind with the same color scheme as eject. And for some reason, Blaster will only mention that he lost eject in that battle. He doesn't mention playback at all. But anyways, the issue opens with Blaster on the outskirts of formerly Gold City, but is now called New Kaon. And this opening perfectly displays Shattered Glass Blaster's personality. He has this need to always be the star, and you guys will see that as this story progresses that he really thinks highly of himself. He even makes a show of taking out Clinch and Gut Cruncher here. He has Rewind count down for him. He even cues Rewind for a spotlight after he takes them out. What's funny here is when Slicer and Rodimus approach, Slicer tells Blaster to stop shining a giant shoot me light on himself. We learn from their discussion that Blaster has been an undercover operative for Ultra Magnus this entire time while working under Optimus. This is yet another thing that we see in this series that really displays just how strategic and intelligent Ultra Magnus is. The fact that he's had his own agents embedded in Goldbug's and Optimus's territory this entire time. I won't be surprised if we find out that he secretly has an agent in Prowl's territory as well. Now, Rodimus isn't happy to see Blaster because Blaster didn't report that he failed defeating Starscream and Megatron. Blaster basically says that he was busy keeping the Decepticons scared until they showed up. Really, this is an excuse. He doesn't want to admit that he failed. Now, what wreckers do to deserters, and especially failures, is the same. You get taken out. And that's what Rodimus is about to do to Blaster. I like this a lot because it's a great example of Rodimus's loyalty and belief in a cause. When he sets his mind on something, it gets done. And we've seen that on this channel in Autocracy and in Last Bot Standing. Fortunately for Blaster, Slicer intervenes. He argues that Blaster is the only bot with the skill set to help them fully accomplish their mission, which is to infiltrate and disrupt New Kaon's base. Now, one of the targets is Soundwave's Decepticon radio, which we learned about and saw in issue 3. And that's where Blaster's gonna come in because he can find his way around those radio frequencies. Rodimus begrudgingly follows Slicer's lead and lets Blaster go with the mission to download any information from Soundwave's radio and then destroy it. So Blaster, along with his cassettes, Steeljaw, Ramhorn, and Rewind, infiltrate Kaon. Just to give you guys insight on how much Blaster is full of himself, in his inner monologue, he calls himself an excellent shot, an irreplaceable TV and radio personality, and a truly iconic leader. So as he sneaks through the city, he comes across Megatron and Jetfire. Now, remember in the final issue of the previous Shattered Glass series, Jetfire didn't want to join Megatron back then because he was still dealing with the feeling that Starscream's death was his fault, and so he left. However, at some point, it seems he returned and joined Megatron and the Decepticons. Blaster tries to listen in on Megatron's and Jetfire's conversation, but he eventually gets bored. So to make it more interesting and get back at Megatron for killing Eject, Blaster uses his subsonic irritation to affect their moods, quickly turning their discussion into a heated argument. Now Blaster literally committed an act that will lead to his downfall, and you guys will see what I mean very soon. So the argument between Jetfire and Megatron is about Jetfire wanting a search party to track down Goldbug, who has Starscream's spark, but Megatron is arguing that he has no resources to spare because he needs to defend New Kaon. He is in the middle of a war. They both end up pulling their blasters on each other, and just as Blaster is enjoying his work, Ramhorn informs him that he's found the source of Soundwave's radio signal. Once Blaster enters Soundwave's radio station, the one thing Blaster mentions in his inner monologue that I want to point out is he says his cassette team is keeping Soundwaves away. And what sucks about that is that we never see that, or even get a glimpse of Soundwave's cassettes. To me, this was such a big missed opportunity. Like, who wouldn't want to see the battle of cassettes between Soundwave and Blaster? Anyways, Blaster hacks his way through Soundwave's computer, and after he does this, he contacts Slicer to report his success. But he finds out that Slicer isn't happy when Slicer informs him that he had to take down a pair of guards talking about a sonic attack on Megatron. What's unclear here is whether these guards witnessed the attack or whether Megatron and Jetfire figured out that they were hit with a sonic attack. Either way, Blaster denies it, and their communication gets interrupted by my boy, heroic Soundwave. Blaster versus Soundwave begins. Blaster shoots his sonic blast at Soundwave, who quickly dodges it. They both exchange sonic blasts at each other, and as Soundwave fires his shoulder cannon, he tries to plead with Blaster by telling him he doesn't want to fight him. But Blaster calls him a liar, and now as their fight continues, Soundwave makes a great point here about Blaster. That after all these cycles, Blaster still doesn't understand either side of the war, and only fights for himself, calling him a conceited rust bucket. Blaster becomes enraged and gains the upper hand in the fight. Now when Blaster says to Soundwave that he's sick of watching bots fall for his empathy act, we learn from Soundwave that Blaster's hatred for him is all based on a grudge, and we will learn what exactly that is in a bit. In the meantime, just as Blaster is about to land a killing blow against Soundwave, an explosion occurs from above and interrupts him. Slicer contacts him to get out of there. Though initially, Blaster is tempted to stay and finish off Soundwave, he doesn't want to risk the wrath of the Wreckers, so he escapes. As he's escaping, he sees explosions from Slicer and Rodimus occurring all over Kaon. He transforms into his alt mode. When Flame War investigates, Blaster unleashes a concussive sonic blast that knocks her and other Decepticons back and blows a hole in the wall that allows him to escape amidst the chaos. Later, on the outskirts of New Kaon, Blaster reunites with Slicer and Rodimus. Rodimus asks Blaster if he destroyed Soundwave's radio, and when Blaster only answers that he downloaded all the information, it's only when Rodimus asks again if he destroyed it that Blaster admits that he didn't and left when Slicer told him to. Despite that, in the eyes of Rodimus, he still failed. When Blaster demands to know where his cassette companions are, Rodimus smiles and says, "You want to know where your fellow failures are?" He then shows Blaster their dead bodies covered by a quilt. Rodimus then backhands Blaster, knocking him to the ground. I want to point out another mistake here. Rodimus's Blaster isn't the same one he had at the beginning of this issue. He now has the same exact one that Blaster does. At gunpoint, he tells Blaster that when he failed his mission to take down Megatron and Starscream, he was thought dead by Ultra Magnus and was written off as KIA. When the Wreckers found out he survived, he should have been killed for failing. However, Slicer gave him another chance, and instead of completing his mission, he played his games with Megatron. So now you guys understand what I meant, that was going to lead to his downfall. Rodimus calls him a failure. Blaster tries to fight back, but come on, this is Rodimus. Blaster cannot beat him, so Rodimus quickly gains the upper hand again. While Blaster is staring down the barrel of Rodimus's gun, his life flashes before his eyes. We go to a flashback of Blaster's initial career as a news anchor for Autobot Broadcast News. What ended his career was after a building frustration over unworthy news stories in his eyes, he unknowingly insulted his viewers while still being live. He was fired and then replaced by Soundwave, so this is when the grudge and hate towards Soundwave began. Blaster then went back to his musical roots and became famous, forming a band with his cassettes. One night when performing, Soundwave approached him about coming on ABN for an interview. Blaster became enraged and viewed it as a handout and then attacked Soundwave. After that incident, his music was basically banned. This is when he started his pirate news radio station, where he spread pro-Autobot propaganda and talked trash about Soundwave. But because of this, sponsors pulled their funding. So to fund his comeback, Blaster did whatever he had to do and eventually ended up working with Ultra Magnus. Now, he thought it was because Magnus saw potential in him, but as we see in reality, he was being chosen just to be cannon fodder. Back in the present day, Blaster believes he's been many things in his life, but he can't be a failure because he's still here until Rodimus pulls the trigger and ends him. While Slicer hacks Blaster's system, he tells Rodimus to take Blaster's body and the cassettes to the outskirts of New Kaon and make it look like the Decepticons took them out in order to keep the heat off of both of them. We then see Slicer has turned Blaster's severed head into a radio with a direct link to Soundwave's radio station frequency. And that is the end of Shattered Glass issue 2. Hey, what is up everyone? James here, and we are back with Transformers Shattered Glass. So real quick before we get into this video, I want to thank every single one of you who recently joined the channel. I woke up one day and was like, oh, we're at 2,000 plus subscribers. It's amazing, I just can't believe it. It's great. Again, thank you all so much. So I recently asked all of you if you wanted me to remaster my first series on Shattered Glass. A lot of you voted yes. I am going to do that, but I want to do it once this series ends. That way we'll have more Shattered Glass videos to look forward to, and we won't officially be done with the series just yet. But once those are done, I'm going to create a massive video of the entire series. I'm really excited about it. Shout out to J. Lou for commenting on what I had in mind. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's start this video. So the issue opens with Slicer visiting Ratchet at his new shop. I like this a lot because it answers the question, did Ratchet survive the attack on Gold City? The last time we saw him was in the first Shattered Glass series first issue, when Blur visited him, who, by the way, we learned in the previous issue, was secretly a wrecker the entire time. Now in that first issue, we learned Ratchet is suffering from some form of PTSD caused by the Autobots who died in battle that he couldn't save. So he spent his days in his shop in Gold City constantly fixing other bots, trying to keep them going. Slicer gives Ratchet's Blaster's optics, which is messed up, but then again, someone using your head as a personal radio is worse. We learned from their discussion that Ratchet had to rush out of his shop when the attack on Gold City happened, and not wanting to leave anyone behind, he was forced to break down the bots he was working on, but unfortunately, they didn't survive reassembly. As their conversation progresses, there are two things I want to point out here that we learned from it. The first thing is Ratchet predicts Slicer is on schedule to lose an arm, and all I'll say is remember that. The second thing is whoever can guess where this arm Ratchet is currently holding is from, I'll pin your comment. I'll give you a hint. It's setting up something we'll see in this series, especially when Ratchet says it's part of an ever-growing list of work for Slicer and Ultra Magnus. Slicer mentions that he thought Ratchet would sound happier considering he gets to continue his work, and they're on the verge of victory. However, for Ratchet, it doesn't matter who wins or loses. To him, it's all the same. He'll be the only one picking up the pieces, trying to save bots. In all reality, Shattered Glass Ratchet isn't a bad guy. He's mostly just trying to save lives. Even when Slicer tries to reassure him that he won't need reassembling, Ratchet grimly says, I have yet to meet a bot who doesn't break that promise, but it's nice to pretend. From there, we go to Slicer traveling through the static zone on his way to Metroplex. What's pretty cool here is we can see him passing by Blur's volcanic stone statue. In his inner monologue, he talks about how he's always held Ratchet in high regard, but their personal philosophies differ. Ratchet is stuck in the past, thinking he can bring it back if he works hard enough. When it comes to Slicer, he can't afford to hold on to the past, so he keeps driving forward because that keeps him alive. As he listens to Soundwave's radio frequency, he mentions how Soundwave and Ratchet are similar. They both are looking to the past. Soundwave wants to honor it, and Ratchet wants to resurrect it. He thinks that's why he keeps listening to it, because it reminds him of Ratchet. Slicer's philosophy isn't only about always moving forward, it's also about survival, because he says you can't change what's happened before. You never know who's going to win tomorrow's battle. You figure out who's the most powerful now and see what they need from you, and then you're good. What I found very interesting is Soundwave says in his radio frequency that he knows there are more Decepticons out there who are listening, but haven't reached out. I do believe there are more Decepticons out there, because when it comes to the Decepticon subgroups, we've only seen the Seekers and the Insecticons so far, and we will see another group in this issue soon. But my question is, where are the Constructicons, Combaticons, Mayhem Attack Squad, and Predacons, like the real heavy hitter groups? Are we to believe they all died in the Great War? I would understand it if that ends up being the case, because it just adds to the tragedy of their defeat, but I hope not. I would like to see at least one of these groups before the series ends. Once Slicer reaches Metroplex, he realizes the Titan has moved. It's not much, but it's worth noticing. He also sees Jetfire flying nearby. So Slicer's mission here is to find Goldbug and signal the Wreckers his location. He begins scouting by planting explosives within Metroplex, and then uses Blaster's head as a compass. How he can do this, especially in the static zone where it shouldn't be possible, is a combination of Blaster's build and Soundwave's radio frequency. The closer he gets to the source of the interference, the less he hears of Soundwave. After many dark hallways, Blaster's head eventually leads him to Starscream's spark. He knows that even if he needs to set off his explosives, the spark will survive because Jetfire mentioned to him many times in the past that it's indestructible. He hears this voice and realizes it's not coming from Blaster or Soundwave. Goldbug comes up behind him and tells him it's from Metroplex, that it repeats every few cycles. Now this showdown doesn't end up being an all-out brawl. Some of you probably thought that was gonna happen, but remember, Goldbug doesn't know Slicer is a double agent. However, Goldbug mentions to Slicer that he thought Jetfire took him out, or after Gold City fell, he thought he would return to his old job, which is working for Ultra Magnus. Remember, he's aware of this because as we learned in the first issue of this series, Goldbug was a part of the initial roster of Wreckers back when he was Bumblebee. Still playing the role of Goldbug's second in command, Slicer lies, saying he went underground for a while. Now we learned through their conversation the reason why Goldbug isn't stomping across conquering Cybertron with Metroplex is because he's constantly starting up and shutting down. He has no way of controlling it. Goldbug ends up hearing static, and Slicer reveals his Blaster Soundwave radio head. When Goldbug asks if he can turn it off, Slicer says he can't. He's lying, of course, because he'd rather hear the head than Goldbug, and he wants to annoy him. As they're both working on Metroplex, Slicer asks questions about his activations. Goldbug starts to become slightly suspicious, but then his temper gets the best of him as usual. He tells Slicer to get Blaster's head out of there before he punts it into space. When Slicer goes outside, he sends a signal to the Wreckers, but at the same time, Jetfire makes his move. As Jetfire flies towards him, the ground begins to shake beneath him. Metroplex activates and yells. Slicer, who usually is confident he'll come out on top since he's a Wrecker, the best of the best, this event brings fear even into his heart. He's set up many bombs, but he's beginning to doubt that they'll do anything. Jetfire stops in his tracks and flies away. When Metroplex eventually deactivates, Slicer realizes two things. First, he would have died and he wouldn't know what he was dying for. And the second thing is, the Titan deactivated when Jetfire fled. Once he returns to Goldbug, he demands to know how long Metroplex is awake when he is activated. Goldbug snaps at him and reminds Slicer he's still in charge. If you're wondering why Slicer doesn't just take out Goldbug already, it's because Ultra Magnus ordered him to stay in character for as long as he can, in order to squeeze out as many details as he can from Goldbug until the rest of the Wreckers arrive. At that moment, Blaster's head picks up Soundwave's radio, and when Soundwave mentions that he knows that the frontline patrols like to listen in, Slicer remembers that the Airstrike Patrol are in the area, and gets an idea. Now this is where the fun begins. Later, somewhere in the static zone, we go to the Airstrike Patrol. Suppose you're not familiar with them, just think of them as the Seeker's little brothers. After doing a status report, they begin discussing whether or not to turn back, until suddenly, Tailwind gets shot out of the sky. Slicer did this out in the open instead of the Wrecker's usual stealth approach because he plans to thin the numbers and get the Airstrike Patrol, Jetfire, and Goldbug to take each other out. I will say it is a bit weird. Jetfire and the Airstrike Patrol seem to not be working together. We aren't given an explanation as to why that is the case. What I think may have happened is after Jetfire and Megatron's argument about tracking down Goldbug in the previous issue, Jetfire ended up tracking him down alone when Megatron refused to spare resources in the endeavor, so Megatron sent the Airstrike Patrol after him. I think that's what makes the most sense. When we get to the end of this issue, I think you guys will agree with me. After Tailwind goes down, the Airstrike Patrol fires at Slicer and Goldbug. However, they don't realize they bit off more than they can chew. In just one shot, Slicer takes out Vesper and Goldbug takes out Night Flight. Goldbug decides to add insult to injury by getting on top of Night Flight's Flight's body and insulting him by calling him a little bug. He also says, "I'll do ya like I did blank." He doesn't finish the sentence. I think he was gonna say Skywarp, referring to the absolute beatdown he gave him back in issue 4 of the first series and ended up taking his head. Stormcloud tries to get the jump on Slicer, but he quickly dodges it and fires his shoulder launcher and obliterates Stormcloud. What I thought was funny here is while Night Flight is slowly dying, he groans and Goldbug says, "Shut up, you're dead." In the meantime, Slicer is waiting for Jetfire to make his move. And after Jetfire is out of the way, he plans to take out Goldbug next. He refuses to die at the hands of a failed wrecker, but out of nowhere Goldbug tackles him, calling him an overgrown patch of rust. Goldbug points his blaster at Slicer's head and reveals he always knew he was still loyal to Ultra Magnus. Goldbug is so distracted that he isn't listening to his surroundings. Jetfire takes advantage of this and viciously smashes him into the ground, literally squashing him like a bug, which seems to be the end of Goldbug. Slicer's plan here really was genius. He got Goldbug away from Metroplex, took out the Airstrike Patrol and Goldbug, and lured Jetfire to his position in order to test his theory, which is when Jetfire is close to Metroplex, he awakens. When Slicer mentions to Jetfire they're both traitors of Gold City, Jetfire pulls his blaster on him and says some bots deserve to be betrayed, and Slicer replies some deserve loyalty. In his inner monologue, he says it's a question he's often posed to himself but never answered because his dangerous work keeps his mind occupied. He self-destructs his arm in order to create a distraction. Now, he's not sure if Ratchet was right about him losing his arm or if Ratchet saying he'll lose his right arm inspired his stunt. He admires Jetfire because his purpose, his motive for revenge, has changed him into something stronger. As he puts it, Starscream's death brought him to life. When Jetfire is about to land a blow on Slicer, he is suddenly strung up by the rest of the wreckers who finally arrived. Once Jetfire is captured, Slicer believes Jetfire's mission of vengeance made him strong, but it also made him vulnerable. He was so focused on that and his past mistakes with Starscream that it blinded him. Despite that, Slicer wonders if any of the wreckers would fight this hard for him. When Drift is about to shoot Jetfire, Slicer stops him and tells him Magnus wants him alive to activate Metroplex. So Drift just ends up injuring Jetfire. In his inner monologue, Slicer mentions how he is proud of his work. The Autobots are winning, Ultra Magnus will get his Titan, and all his enemies, Autobot and Decepticon, will fall at his feet. What's interesting is Slicer questions himself. He poses the question that's almost like having a purpose, right? Though he's won the battle, the fight isn't over just yet, because when he looks into the distance, he sees a great host. He sees Flame War and her Decepticon crew approaching fast towards him and the Wreckers. That's the end of the issue. Hey, what's up, Beyonders? This is James, and we are back at it again with Shattered Glass covering issue 4. Alright, so for this issue, I'm going to do the flashbacks first because we have quite a few. So the first one here occurs as the war between the heroic Decepticons and evil Autobot autocrats began to rage on Cybertron. This battle here is for the Titan's Net. Now, the Titan's Net is something IDW created within the Transformers universe. It's Cybertron's global network that allows these bots that are called city speakers, who are Transformers who master the ability to communicate and control the Titans. Specifically, the Titan Defense Fleet, which is a fleet of Titans that are massive starships stationed in Cybertron's orbit. They protected Cybertron and were sent wherever else they were needed in the galaxy. As the battle takes place, we see Soundwave and Flame War enter the fray. Now, Flame War in the Shatterglass universe is a part of the Decepticon pirate crew called the Rising Sea, and I love that name so much. And their captain is Cannonball. We learned from her inner monologue that the Decepticons at some point were able to take the Titan's Net from the Autobots. Instead of trying to take it back, the Autobots are here to destroy it. The attack is led by Windblade and her City Crashers, who are known as Titan Killers. Once Flame War and Soundwave enter the control room, they see Rodimus is squeezing the head of one of Soundwave's mini cassettes, Frenzy. Cannonball orders them to stay back, assuring them that he's got Rodimus, but Rodimus throws Frenzy right into his face. Before we go any further into this battle, I want to point out what Cannonball and Flame War have in common, which is they both made their first appearances in Fun Publications' Transformers Timelines. Flame War's first appearance was in Timelines issue number 1, Descent into Evil. It's a pre-Beast Wars story where she was one of the last Decepticons and was an agent of the Tripredacus Council, just like Ravage was in the Beast Wars show. Cannonball appeared in a tech story called The Dark Heart of Sandokan. I hope I pronounced that correctly. It honestly sounds like something out of the Dune books. In that universe, he was also a Decepticon pirate captain. His crew manned the Decepticon pirate warship, the Sea Slag. Now back to the battle. It's initially 3-on-1, and Rodimus can hold his own even outnumbered. He isn't alone for long though, because Windblade ambushes Cannonball and throws him at Soundwave. As Flame War and Rodimus battle, Cannonball warns her she can't take him on. Though she gains the upper hand in their fight, that doesn't last long. Rodimus grabs her leg and slams her body against the wall, completely taking her out of the fight. Before he can land a killing blow, Cannonball stops him and tells Flame War to go. Though we don't see it, Flame War implies, and even later in the story states, that Rodimus killed Cannonball. She says in her inner monologue that she doesn't know whether the blow Rodimus gave her or watching this moment broke her. Sometime later, we see the Rising Sea crew in this bar having a memorial for Cannonball. Like all memorials, they're reminiscing about the good days until Megatron interrupts, wishing to extend his condolences. As Megatron explains how Cannonball and him didn't differ much, they only argued about the methods to fight the war. This is where Cannonball's death gets confusing, because Flame War gives another account of how he died in her inner monologue. She says as their ship, the Rising Sea, was exploding, Cannonball shoved her and the crew into escape pods, and his last words to them were they had to live and rise from the rubble. Let me know what you guys think, because just like the first issue focusing on Ultra Magnus, the flashbacks here were jumbled around, so you kind of had to like figure it out and put it in order. So maybe I missed something. Megatron offers the Rising Sea crew a place in the Decepticon movement. Initially, he believes Slipstream is the crew's leader, and so Flame War asks what's the job. Slipstream reveals that she is the leader, but the crew goes where Flame War goes. The next flashback actually continues the flashback from Shatterglass issue 2 in the first series, where we saw the final battle on Earth take place between the Decepticons and the Autobots. During the battle, Megatron had ordered Starscream and the Seekers to gather all the Decepticons they could and get off Earth, while he sacrificed himself to buy them as much time as possible. Flame War wasn't happy about it and looked at it as Starscream betraying Megatron. She didn't care to hear anything Starscream had to say. She didn't care that it was ordered by Megatron, because in her mind, it was like losing Cannonball all over again. We then go into more present day. This is after Blaster's raid on Kaon, which took place in the issue 2 of this current series. We saw him use his sonic abilities that caught Flame War and the Rising Sea crew off guard, and the blast smashed through a wall, allowing him to escape. As the Rising Sea crew is fixing the wall, Flame War is angry that Megatron hasn't ordered her and the crew to strike the Autobots before they can activate Metroplex. Even though Slipstream reminds her that Megatron is being cautious, Flame War argues that Cannonball wouldn't have sat back and waited. She says, "We're rebels. We're the crew of the Rising Sea. We're not Constructicons." Her passionate speech successfully convinces the crew to strike with her. They transform and speed toward the static zone. As Flame War says, the sea rises again. This leads us to where we left off in the last issue, with the Rising Sea heading towards the Wreckers. However, in this issue, we see Metroplex is with the Wreckers, which shouldn't be possible. Let me explain. We saw half of his body was still deep beneath the ground in the last issue. Also, Slicer got Goldbug away from Metroplex, where they got into a fight with the Airstrike Patrol, and lured Jetfire to their position. He planned to take Goldbug out and test his theory on how close Jetfire has to be to activate Metroplex. Since we know there's no time gap between issues, Metroplex magically being here really doesn't make any sense. Now, why he is activated and moving does get explained in the final issue. I think Danny Lore, who is writing this, is playing it fast and loose here because of the limited number of issues they have to finish this series. It's just a thing that happens in the world of comics, which I understand, so please don't take my criticism as me bashing the comic. Now back to the battle. Flame War doesn't shake at the sight of the Titan, but she does shake with anger when she sees the Wrecker who killed Cannonball and nearly killed her, Rodimus. Despite Slipstream trying to warn her to be cautious, to devise a plan and not charge recklessly into battle, Flame War ignores her and charges toward Rodimus. As the Wreckers take Jetfire into Metroplex, Rodimus takes notice of Flame War. Before he heads toward her, he tries to order Slicer not to make Jetfire comfortable, but Slicer reminds him he's in charge while Ultra Magnus preps for Ratchet's procedure. Now remember this because we will see more about that later. Now the fight between Rodimus and Flame War comes across as more evenly matched than their past fight. She's holding her own against him. Hailstorm tries to back her up by firing one of his rockets, but Hailstorm forgets he's dealing with someone who's quick on the draw. Rodimus fires at him and boom, down goes Hailstorm in a flash. Flame War, enraged, leaps onto Rodimus' shoulders, bashing his head until Slipstream flies over and grabs her. Slipstream tries to get her out of there, but Flame War refuses. She forces herself out of Slipstream's arms, diving down towards Rodimus as he fires his blaster and wrist cannon at her. But before she can even hit the ground, one of his blasts knocks her out. Later, she awakens inside Metroplex, handcuffed alongside Optimus Prime. So after beating the brakes off him, it seems Ultra Magnus has had him a prisoner this entire time. Now, remember what Slicer said earlier about Magnus getting ready for Ratchet's procedure? It involves Optimus Prime. Now, Flame War wonders why she is still alive, and Slicer informs her she will be used as a bargaining chip. Initially, she thinks they also captured Soundwave, but then she realizes it's just his radio coming from Blaster's head. She quickly deduces Slicer must have done that to Blaster, and she doesn't understand why he or the Wreckers would do that to their own. This is where Slicer explains how the Wreckers operate, and I like it a lot. He says the Wreckers care about the wrecking more than anything else. If Ultra Magnus told us to turn our guns against each other, we'd all enjoy the slaughter. So to no surprise, the Wreckers are a bunch of psychopaths, which is fitting. This harkens back to the last issue where we learn Slicer looks at being a Wrecker as a job. He doesn't fight for someone else or have a purpose like Jetfire. The Wreckers don't view each other as teammates or brother in arms, so they won't fight hard for each other like the Decepticons. They don't believe in some great cause or follow Ultra Magnus because they fear him. They do respect his intelligence, but at the end of the day, he pays them. He gives them a job that allows them to wreck and ruin. Now, Flame War tries to get more information from Slicer on Ratchet's procedure, but he refuses to give up any details. Slipstream, having successfully snuck into Metroplex, gets the jump on Slicer and is able to get the keys for Flame War's shackles. They both begin to take the fight to Slicer, but even though it's 2-on-1, he's still a Wrecker at the end of the day, so they know they need to be cautious. They gain the upper hand in the fight when Flame War grabs Blaster's head, threatening to destroy it. That's something I want you guys to take note of. Why has Slicer become so attached to Blaster's head that he hesitates on taking them both out? She asks Slicer again about Ratchet's procedure on Ultra Magnus. The only details he gives is he says maybe the boss wants to see how he looks in Optimus's colors in the mirror. Initially, I thought the procedure was Ratchet stripping Optimus of his frame while still being alive and attaching it to Ultra Magnus. Let's just say in the final issue, I don't know if that scenario is more messed up than the one we end up getting. It's crazy. Slicer leaps towards Slipstream, trying to grab her and use her as a hostage, but he isn't fast enough. Flame War blasts him in the chest before he can do it. What bothered me here is the blast is so strong that it blows Slicer back into a wall within Metroplex that breaks on impact and has him fly out. I feel like that shouldn't be possible because, for example, in Autocracy, we saw Metroplex, who just like this one was asleep for many cycles, take a blast from the Van Park Annihilator that unleashes a powerful beam, and it didn't even scratch his armor. I couldn't even find an image in this issue or in past issues depicting maybe the wall's structure to be damaged already. Unless they're trying to say Metroplex is weak on the inside? It's not a big deal, it was just weird to me. Slipstream tells Flame War they should leave, but she knows she is not leaving until she gets her revenge on Rodimus. However, at that moment, Flame War is frozen. She doesn't know what to do. She thinks about how she could stay and fight him. Even if she died in the process, in her eyes, it would still be worth it. But she then thinks about Slicer's words, about how the Wreckers operate. They don't care about each other as the Decepticons do, as she and the crew do. She then remembers her last conversation with Slipstream, and this conversation probably takes place before Blaster's raid. Flame War is thinking about Cannonball, that if he were still around, they would be out there fighting. Slipstream agrees and mentions he knew the Rising Sea crew better than anyone. Slipstream reveals to Flame War that Cannonball believed she could be a great leader if she didn't let her anger blind her so much, because in those moments, she doesn't know the difference between a leader and a martyr. Initially, Flame War doesn't understand what she means. Slipstream explains, when you're not focused on avenging Cannonball or thinking about what he would do, when you're yourself focused on the present and the crew, that's when you're most like him. Wherever you go, I go. I'd just like to follow my captain again one of these days. I love this conversation because at that moment, Flame War realizes that her vengeance blinded her so much that she forgot why Cannonball died and forgot about her purpose. If she ran after Rodimus, Slipstream would most likely die, as Hailstorm did, just like the last time she ran off to give revenge. In her mind, she would be just like Slicer, a bot with no real crewmates. Cannonball died so they could live, and Megatron stayed on Earth so they could escape to fight another day. If she died right now, who would tell Megatron about Ultra Magnus's plan? So like them, like a true leader, she's going to sacrifice her revenge for the betterment of her crewmates. She says in her inner monologue, killing Rodimus would be sweet revenge, but there's plenty of revenge to get on the battlefield. What we see next is Megatron, Soundwave, and the rest of the Decepticon forces battling the Wreckers and Metroplex. That's the end of the video. Hey, what's up everyone? James here, and we are back. We are here. We have finally made it to the end of IDW's Transformers Shattered Glass. What a journey we have been on. And it's so fitting that in this final issue, we are focusing on my boy, my favorite Shattered Glass bot, Heroic Soundwave. I'm not going to keep you guys waiting any longer. Let's get right into the action. So the story opens right where we left off, where the final battle for Metroplex continues to rage on. Soundwave is dragging an injured Megatron to safety as his mini cassettes cover him. Megatron tries to urge Soundwave to leave him and stop Ultra Magnus from controlling Metroplex. As Soundwave is stabilizing him, Megatron informs him of Flame War's discoveries, how Magnus has Optimus Prime captured and is set up for a procedure to be performed by Ratchet. After Soundwave patches up Megatron, he orders Ravage and the other cassettes to stay and protect Megatron as he marches toward Metroplex. Soundwave deduces that Magnus wants to become Optimus because it will be easier for him to sway Optimus's forces, especially the Loyalists, to fall under his command. Just to let you guys know, it is a lot deeper than that, and we will find that out later. In the meantime, we learn through Soundwave's inner monologue that he can hear what's really going on with Metroplex. That he isn't just waking, he is screaming in agony, and he hears not only Metroplex, but Starscream's cries as well. He gets distracted for a moment when he sees a bot being crushed beneath one of Metroplex's fingers. As he goes to help this bot, he is suddenly rammed from behind by one of the Wreckers, Springer. Soundwave hits Springer with a sonic blast that knocks him out, and he then continues to charge toward the helpless bot. Now, if you're wondering why Soundwave knocked out Springer instead of landing a killing blow, it's because, as you'll see in this issue, Soundwave tries to avoid killing if he can. I wouldn't say he is a pacifist. For me, I thought of him as more like a Jedi, or Goku from DBZ, my favorite anime. He believes every life is worth something, and that everyone can be redeemed and changed. He won't kill you, but he will if he absolutely has to. Now, the pinned bot he saves is revealed to be Slicer, who fires his blaster at him, but luckily Soundwave was able to dodge it in time. Soundwave then uses his ability to hear thoughts on Slicer, and I love that Danny Lore is using this ability he had on the original show. He called it brain scan on the show, where an antenna would pop out of his head and he would have to scan his target. Whereas here, all he has to do is focus and listen, making it less mechanical and more natural, if that makes sense. Soundwave explains how it works, how he's able to do this. It's because thoughts are just sound tuned to a certain frequency. He can access it and understand its subsonic tones. When he listens to Slicers, he can hear how his thoughts are conflicted. They're filled with Soundwave's broadcasts, Ratchet, Ultra Magnus, and the Wreckers. He tells Slicer that Metroplex can't be controlled and that deep down he knows it's true. He heard Starscream and Metroplex's voices. Suddenly Springer awakens and charges toward Soundwave. When Soundwave hits him with a sonic blast to the knee, Slicer ends up shooting Springer with a blaster shot to the face. Initially, he is shocked that he killed a fellow Wrecker. Soundwave tries to help him cope with what he's done, but when he listens to Slicer's mind now, he can hear how quiet it is, how it's not conflicted anymore. Slicer says, "Let's go kill my boss, Mr. DJ." Even though Danny Lore has been kinda setting up Slicer's turn here for 2 issues, I know it's still going to seem abrupt to some of you. And I must admit, initially it did come across that way to me. But remember, he admires and respects Ratchet. To him, Soundwave is a lot similar to Ratchet. He also has been listening to Soundwave's radio frequencies through Blaster's head this entire time. And as we saw in the last issue, he has become attached to it. It seems like he's grown to admire and respect Soundwave. And to add on to that point, Soundwave even points out how he can hear his frequencies stuck in Slicer's head like a hit song. Now, having joined forces, Soundwave and Slicer climb up Metroplex. And what's cool here is once they reach an entrance, Soundwave uses Slicer's voice to catch Ricochet and Jazz off guard, and he gets the jump on them. He blasts Ricochet out of Metroplex and knocks out Jazz. Inside, Soundwave and Slicer traverse through Metroplex and come across the severed leg of Ultra Magnus. Initially, Slicer thinks there may have been complications with his surgery due to Metroplex moving, but this is where the story gets dark. The severed leg leads them to a morbid discovery. They find Ultra Magnus's body screaming threats it can't say because Ratchet disabled his voice box. Soundwave deduces the surgery must have worked, and he's quickly proven right when he gets a front row seat he wishes he could refuse. He and Slicer meet face to face with the Wreckers and Ultra Magnus in Optimus Prime's body. Before anyone points it out, yes, all they did was change his frame color from purple to blue and give him a long poleaxe. But I don't care. He looks freaking amazing. Also, what really makes this dark is since Magnus is in Optimus's body, that means Optimus is in Magnus's body screaming threats he can't say. Magnus talks some trash here when he meets with Soundwave. He tells Soundwave he thought Megatron would send one of his assassins or spies to take him out, not his grief counselor. Now, he says this because for those of you who've read or watched my video on issue 3 of the first Shatterglass series, we learned in that issue Soundwave was operating beneath Gold City, running his underground Decepticon radio, still continuing his job as the morale officer of the Decepticons. He was helping bots to deal with their trauma, depression, and PTSD. It's why I've personally dubbed him ever since then as Heroic Soundwave, the truest hero of the Decepticons. Soundwave does clap back at Magnus, saying, "You don't have the speech patterns down. Try more grunts, you've got the smugness." Now, Slicer acts like he is still one of the Wreckers, making it seem like he brought Soundwave before Magnus. Through his thoughts, he secretly conveys to Soundwave to keep talking. Suddenly, Magnus loses his balance, and Ratchet goes to help him, and reminds Magnus that they didn't finish running all the calibrations. Magnus pushes him back, telling him he's already figuring out how to compensate for what he calls a barbaric frame, and he has the Wreckers after all. This does beg the question, why did Magnus switch to Optimus's frame if he considers it barbaric? Remember this, because as I said earlier, it's much deeper. When Magnus orders Slicer to take out Soundwave, Slicer gets into Magnus's face, stepping between him and Soundwave. At that moment, Soundwave can hear Slicer beginning to broadcast his thoughts to him. Slicer tells him at his signal they have only a moment to knock out the Wreckers, not kill. He's being considerate of Soundwave. After they do, he's going to grab Ratchet and run. As Soundwave listens to Slicer's plans, his thoughts get interrupted by Metroplex's and Starscream's screams syncing up. He says if they line up, they both will be lost forever. Metroplex screams, causing a massive earthquake. It's as if Cybertron itself is crumbling. I love how the artist behind this series, Guido Guidi, drew this. It reminded me of when Gohan went Super Saiyan 2 for the first time in the DBZ series. As Metroplex is raging, everything inside of him begins to shake and collapse. Slicer and Soundwave use the chaos to make their move. Some rubble falls on Ultra Magnus, Slicer grabs Ratchet, and Soundwave begins to battle the Wreckers. Drift tells Soundwave he's outmatched, but Soundwave doesn't care. He grabs Tailgate and throws him at Drift. He's willing to do and face whatever he has to in order to save Metroplex and Starscream. Rodimus shoots Slicer, expressing to him how he's wanted to do that for a long time. He then shoots Ratchet, wanting Slicer to suffer more before he kills him. As Soundwave goes head to head with Drift, he sees Slicer is in trouble. Knowing he can't save Starscream alone and wanting to save as many as he can, he remembers all the horrors the Wreckers have committed and makes the only choice he can. He blasts a hole into Drift's chest, and it doesn't end there. He grabs one of his blades and hurls it into Rodimus's head. This was absolutely incredible. Soundwave cuts Jetfire free, and initially Jetfire wants to get payback on Slicer, but Soundwave reminds him that Starscream needs his help. They fly to Metroplex's spark chamber, and once they reach it, Jetfire is in awe of Starscream's spark. Soundwave tells him he'll sever the connection between Metroplex and Starscream's spark. After he does, he needs to take Starscream's spark to safety immediately. After the connection is successfully severed, Jetfire scoops up Starscream's spark. As Metroplex, now incapacitated, begins to topple, Jetfire flies away. At that moment, Magnus enters the chamber, and he strikes Soundwave so hard with his long poleaxe that it sends him flying out of Metroplex's cracked eye. He tells Soundwave he'll do what Optimus was too arrogant to do. The hit was so hard that Soundwave can't hear anything. But when Magnus leaps toward him about to land the killing blow, Soundwave meets him with a boot to the face. As they battle outside on the eye of Metroplex, this is where we learn the real reason why Ultra Magnus stole Optimus's body. Soundwave says, "I can read your mind. You had to steal Optimus's skin because you were too scared to lead without it." Now, on one hand, this does make sense. Because remember, at first, Ultra Magnus was looked at as just the legal advisor and intelligence officer working under Optimus. No one feared or respected him. However, on the other hand, I would argue he grew to have that reputation. He successfully led the Wreckers, and their reputation was well known. They carried out deadly missions, took out the entire Senate, and performed Imperata on Shockwave. And Magnus himself beat the hell out of Optimus. I would even argue his size and skull face look he had is way more intimidating than Optimus's frame. So to me, Magnus already had everything he needed to sway all of Optimus's forces under him. Now, the argument I'll make against myself is maybe the great tragedy of Magnus is no matter what he did or gained, still didn't change how he viewed or felt about himself. Soundwave's words enrage Magnus. He headbutts Soundwave, and just as he's about to throw Soundwave off of Metroplex, he is suddenly shot in the chest. Magnus drops Soundwave and falls to his death. Soundwave triangulates the shot, and it leads to a bot who said he would run, Slicer. Metroplex continues to topple as Soundwave holds on for dear life. Luckily, at that moment, Laserbeak flies in and saves him. After the battle, and after many cycles of loss, the Decepticons are finally victorious. Soundwave says in his inner monologue, "There's so much horror and death on the battlefield, more than I can process, but we all had our reasons. I went into battle because there's life on the other side of the war, for all of us, if we're brave enough to face it. If we are determined to live with ourselves and what we've become. It may get worse before it can get better, but I will never stop believing peace is worth it, that Cybertron is worth fighting for. The story ends with the last Autobot warlord, Prowl, looking upon the battlefield, and Soundwave and the Decepticons looking at the sunset as they continue to fight for a better tomorrow. And that is the end of Transformers Shattered Glass, and the final issue of IDW's 17-year run of Transformers. Well, I hope you all enjoyed the video and this series. This may be the end of IDW, but this isn't the end of our journey. I'm still going to remaster the first series of Shattered Glass, and we're going to still continue our journey covering the entire universe. Other than that, I hope all of you have an awesome day, and always remember, every day to transform and go beyond. See you later, Beyonders.